Hello everyone, this is Christian Massar again with another episode of the podcast. It has been a long time, but again, please keep in mind that this is a hobby project. It is not a professional project, so I won't be as regularly posting as regularly as I might like. But we're here with a new one, and let's get started. We're going a little bit into a philosophical vein here. This time talking about Thomas Aquinas and Alisdair Macintyre and their perspectives on Bertrand Russell. Now, Thomas Aquinas was born centuries before Bertrand Russell, so obviously this was not a contemporary opinion of Aquinas towards Russell, but kind of looking at their works and so on, we want to have kind of theorize how they would act, or how they would see Bertrand Russell. So Thomas Aquinas and Alisdair Macintyre. So let's get started. Bertrand Russell pulled no punches when giving his opinion on Christian religion. He said this, quote, "I say deliberately that the Christian religion, as organized in its churches, has been and still is the principal enemy of moral progress in the world." So again, how might other philosophers respond to this statement, particularly, again, the Catholic theologian St. Thomas Aquinas? What about Alisdair Macintyre, who believed that, quote, practices or activities in a, perhaps, quote, professional community, maybe this is religious activities in a church, he believed that these are a foundation of ethics. So how might these two philosophers, Macintyre and Thomas Aquinas, reply to Russell's quote against organized Christianity? So before we can analyze Aquinas and Macintyre's possible responses to Bertrand Russell, I must first interpret Russell's words as I understand them. And so I take this as I'm not a philosophy major by any means. I'm more of an historian, so I'm not a philosopher. But as I understand them, this is how it is. I will not look at Bertrand Russell's thoughts outside of this quote, since it's outside the scope of this work. So I won't quote other passages from this where he quoted this and after in all these things. So I'm not going to quote him in other sources. I'm just looking at this quote that Bertrand Russell made. So please keep that in mind. So in that quote I gave, Bertrand Russell was saying that the Christian religion has stinted or delayed the development of progressive values. Though he does not explicitly mention them, I think it's safe to surmise that here Russell is blaming Christian dogma, doctrines, and organizations. Russell's claim rests on the belief that Christian teaching and doctrine is against liberal, quote, moral progress, in that most Christian organizations and teachings forbid homosexuality, abortion, the ordination of female priests and preachers, and other things that Russell would likely call progressive causes. And again, I'm not finding Russell's specific beliefs about homosexuality and so on, but I'm just looking at his thoughts that organized Christianity was an enemy to liberal progress. So I'm kind of making an assumption there, or perhaps an overgeneralization. It is also very likely that Russell objected to Christianity's claim to objective truth against those of other religions, or perhaps other belief systems that are non-religious. Russell's rebuke of Christianity does, however, have a caveat. He targets Christianity, quote, again, as it is organized in its churches. And I put the emphasis there. And it is was also added by me. Christian belief does not seem to be his problem per se. If this is the case, Russell seems to be advocating a, quote, churchless Christianity, one without priests, creeds, or doctrine. Thus, he seems to be propagating the views of someone who is, quote, spiritual but not religious. So this is a very common belief you'll see, where people like the idea of Jesus, or they like the idea of Christianity, but they don't want it organized in, say, a Baptist church, or the Church of Christ, or a Pentecostal church, or a Catholic church. They want to live in a churchless Christianity. So now that I have explained my views of Russell's quote, let's begin with Thomas Aquinas. Knowing that Aquinas was a medieval Roman Catholic theologian, we can all agree, I think, that he would object to Russell's rebuke of the churches as a, quote, enemy of moral progress. Of course, Aquinas, and Russell very likely, would be familiar with the passage of Christian scripture where Jesus says to the Apostle Peter in Matthew 16:18, quote, and according to the English Standard Version, Matthew 16:18. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, singular, emphasis mine, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. So the Apostle Paul also wrote about the central role of the spiritual church in Christianity, even calling Christ the head of the church, which is described as his body. And you could read this in Ephesians 5:23. The Christian community, Paul says, makes up the church. For Thomas Aquinas' part, he teaches on this in the third part of his great work, the Summa Theologica. In this book, he gives Catholic teaching in the forms of answers to hypothesized theological objections, much like how Socrates rebuked the arguments of Thrasymachus in the Republic. At one point in the Summa Theologica, Aquinas refutes those who may disagree with the idea that Christ is the head of the church. He points to the Apostle Paul's teachings about the church being, quote, one mystic body, like the natural body of a man, in which diverse members have diverse acts or perhaps roles. So very much repeating Paul's point about the church being Christ's body. The theologian then appeals to three concepts to prove that Jesus is the church's head: order, perfection, and power. Aquinas references Romans 8:29, where Christ is called the, quote, firstborn, or first in order, amongst many brethren, which refers to Christians in the church. So Jesus being the firstborn among Christian brethren. Jesus was also described as someone, quote, full of grace and truth. Christ was perfect, according to John 1:14 in the Christian Bible. And finally, Aquinas says that Jesus has the power to be gracious to all, quote, members of the church. In this way, not only does Aquinas revere Jesus as the supreme being, he also confirms the importance of the church in Christian life. It is, after all, again, under the headship or command of Christ. Aside from appealing to Christian scripture and theology, Aquinas also uses logical arguments against objectors regarding the headship of Christ over the church. His second hypothetical objection reads thus, quote, further, it is not fitting for the head to have a head, but God is the head of Christ as man, according to 1 Corinthians 11:3. The head of Christ is God. Therefore, Christ himself is not a head. So this is the hypothetical objection. The head cannot have a head. But in response, Aquinas warns his opponents not to take metaphors literally, quote, in all respects. He concedes that a head does not literally have another head, of course, and a body cannot literally be another part of another body. But a body can be part of a metaphorical body, quote, in an ordered multitude. A soldier in an army has a sergeant that heads or leads him, and a general commands the sergeant. Aquinas uses the example of a human father who can be the head, leader, and guardian of his household and children. In turn, the local government official will in turn be the head of that father. And hence, Aquinas concludes, there is no reason why God should not be the head of Christ, although Christ himself is the head of the church. We see here Aquinas' arguments for the primacy of the church under the leadership of Christ, who is perfect in Christian belief. So we can understand that he would vehemently disagree with Russell's claim that Christian churches, or organized Christianity, are the source of moral stagnation. But so far, we have seen Aquinas defend the spiritual idea of the church as Christ's body. We have not yet seen Aquinas address the organized or physical side of the church. This would, again, be the Roman Catholic Church organization and clergy in Aquinas' case. To see his thoughts on this, let us go to another part of the Summa Theologica. When addressing the question of retiring clergy, Aquinas notes that churchmen show love towards God and others by helping them achieve salvation through teaching and religious service. Here, he defends the idea of an organized Catholic clergy working for God, Christians, and indeed the salvation of all the world. So, in serving the spiritual church, priests also serve the physical church, in a way, and the world, helping them align themselves with the spiritual church. Aquinas believed that everything works towards an end that is in its own good. We can see this in another work of his, the Summa Contra Gentiles. As a Catholic, he of course believed that God was the supreme good, towards which everything should be directed. This includes the church, as we have already seen Aquinas depicting as the body in which all Christians reside and in which all clergy work to support that body, in both a spiritual and a physical sense. Therefore, we've seen Aquinas' objections to a claim like Bertrand Russell's that churches are the enemies of morality. Because all things, the church included, have an end good of some kind in mind, and because the church is under God the Father and Christ, Aquinas would reject Russell's words as an attack on the church whose purpose was to serve God, who is the ultimate good. Of course, this assumes that Aquinas' beliefs about salvation and God are true. If they are true, then Aquinas is right to say that the Catholic Church and its clergy do, in fact, help and promote the ultimate good found in God. If, conversely, Aquinas is wrong about the supreme good, then Russell's quote is much more valid. But we must stop there, because we have already seen how Thomas Aquinas, a defender of the Catholic Church, might have responded to Bertrand Russell. What about the other philosopher in our view, Alisdair Macintyre? In his book, called After Virtue, Macintyre defines what he calls practices. He says that Aristotle defined practices as, quote, some well-defined type of human practice, or skills. Aristotle had in mind skills such as geometry, or warfare, sports, and playing musical instruments. Macintyre, however, uses the word practices to refer to actions that people do to show virtues or ethical behavior. Here's what he writes in his book After Virtue. By a practice, I am going to mean any coherent and complex form of socially established cooperative human activity through which goods internal to that form of activity are realized in the course of trying to achieve these standards of excellence which are appropriate to that form of activity, with the result that human powers to achieve excellence and human conceptions of the ends and goods involved are systematically extended. Oof. Macintyre says here that when someone participates in what he calls a practice, he or she is doing something in some kind of community that promotes excellence according to that community's standards. For example, I might be a doctor, I'm not, but I might be a doctor that contributes to excellence in the medical field by helping my patients or doing research to increase medical knowledge. Of course, I must follow the laws and standards of medical practice. I cannot just do things as I may want. Or I can be on a Facebook group and help it excel by exhibiting virtues within it, according to the community's guidelines and admin rules. In the context of Bertrand Russell's anti-church quote, we can apply Macintyre's definition of practices according to a community's standards. This can be done even if Macintyre does not explicitly mention churches. We can still apply his opinions to a church setting. Therefore, in a church, whether we are talking about a local congregation or an organized church body, people are expected to build up and contribute to that body. Church members may contribute their time and finances to church activities, and they may help increase the body by bringing in new converts. Christians can study doctrine through Christian scriptures or church creeds. This would help them, in Macintyre's words, better understand that a body's standards of excellence, quote, and obedience to rules, or to better understand that body's standards of excellence and obedience to rules. Due to their religion's rules, such as do not murder, do not steal, and so on, they, quote, accept the authority of the church's standards. Their own activities, desires, and preferences are to be under the head of the church's guidance. In doing this, church members show virtues that help the community. This is where Macintyre combines community standards with what he calls, quote, internal goods. Internal goods, he says, are the results of people contributing to the community's excellence. They enrich the whole community and help it prosper. These are contrasted with external goods, such as fame or money, which create win-lose situations. As examples of internal goods, Macintyre even envisions W.G. Grace's contributions to cricket, who had a special bat-swinging technique. Grace advanced the art, quote-unquote, to make his, quote, professional community better. If Macintyre appreciates the work of Thomas Aquinas, he should argue that Aquinas' theological and philosophical thoughts brought many, quote, internal goods to the Christian, Catholic specifically, community. Aquinas helped the Catholic community become more excellent, Macintyre might say. Macintyre does not, however, say that contributing to a community is inherently good for every person. There will be disagreements among members of a body. The great number of types of Christian denominations or churches is just one piece of evidence showing this. There may be times when an individual needs to work on his or her own virtue or practice instead of contributing more to his or her community. Quote, contributing to sustaining the kind of community in which the virtues can flourish may be incompatible with the devotion within a particular practice of the arts, for example, requires, says Macintyre. Church members are expected to contribute to the excellence of the church in which they participate, yes, but what happens when an individual no longer believes in God or that church's work? This would result in an individual being forced to choose between the rival claims, so to speak, of the church's virtues and his or her own. Communities are, after all, made up of individuals with their own minds and attitudes, despite the community standards placed upon them. If Bertrand Russell and Alisdair Macintyre were having a conversation about this, Russell would likely use this point to show that religious church bodies, for example synods, cardinals, popes, preachers, do not have the ultimate authority over individual Christian practice or Christian practice as a whole. Macintyre continues by saying that community virtues are not necessarily good in themselves. There are limits. He mentions the medieval concept of patience as an example. Macintyre says that many people in medieval times believed that one showed patience when he or she would never give up on a task or another person. God is patient, they would say, so we must also never abandon anything. But Macintyre rebuts, persevering in such a way is only good insofar as an overriding or ultimate good is achieved. Applying this to a church body or any other community, contributing to that church's internal goods is not useful if it does not lead to an ultimately good result. Virtues, quote, in relation to practices do build up good communities, as we saw Macintyre argue earlier. But the other, perhaps more ultimate definition of virtue, he says, is when it seeks the good of humanity. In his own words, quote, good life for man is the life spent in seeking the good life for man, and the virtues necessary for the seeking are those which will enable us to understand what more and what else the good life for man is. If a church or other community is promoting internal values that go against the good life for man, Macintyre would take issues with this. I believe we can confidently surmise that Macintyre would agree with Russell that some churches' previous actions were wrong. Inquisitions, witch trials, persecutions, manipulation in mission fields, and the prioritization of politics over doctrine or love. After all, Macintyre does not see a community's traditions as things to preserve simply for their own sake. Traditions are good as long as they appreciate how the past has created good opportunities for the future. As far as church practices go, Macintyre would appreciate them if they contribute to the, quote, good life for man. When preachers encourage church members to love each other and their enemies, when churches visit prisoners, and when church doctrine preaches the love of Christ, this is what Macintyre would appreciate, despite Russell's claim that seems to suggest churches have only hurt humanity. In conclusion, Alisdair Macintyre would argue that a church provides an opportunity, though he specifically mentions professionals such as artists rather than preachers and priests. Virtues may be shown in a church community context that appreciates the church's past while looking forward to potential future chances to improve the condition of human beings. For example, again, showing love to others and not persecuting them. In this way, churches could, in fact, contribute to, quote, moral progress, countering Bertrand Russell's idea that they are always a detriment. It is nearly impossible to see what one person would say about another's views unless they are directly discussing or addressing them in writing. Thomas Aquinas cannot respond to Bertrand Russell because he died centuries before the latter was even born, as I mentioned before. But in analyzing his thoughts on the subject Russell was addressing, we can take a stab at what Aquinas would say. Such exercises are interesting because they help us analyze hypothetical arguments between two people that cannot respond to each other. It gives us a greater understanding of both people's points. Well, that's it for today. A little hypothetical philosophical exercise, a little bit of history there with Thomas Aquinas. I hope you're all doing well, and I hope to record another podcast episode soon. But again, this is a hobby project. It's a side project. So we will see, and I hope to do it soon. Take care, and have a good one.